Welcome, everybody, to CSM Mastermind. I'm Andrew Marks, co-founder of Success Hacker and our success coaching training program. We're back for our monthly live webcast today talking about aligning desired outcomes to their corporate objectives, aligning desired customer outcomes to their corporate objectives. This learning opportunity is brought to you by Success Coaching, the world leader in customer success, professional development training with now more than 30,000 students from nearly 100 different countries. Our skills development platform is making an impact across the globe. Whether you prefer self-paced learning, an instructor-led boot camp, an interactive workshop, or a personalized weekly coaching program, our wide range of customer-focused programs and formats are tailored to meet the unique needs and learning preferences of everyone. If you're eager to level up your customer-facing skills, don't miss out on our amazing learning opportunities that can truly transform your professional journey. Ashley has dropped a link to our program page and any coupons that we're offering right now in the chat. And you can find out more about all of our programs and workshops at successcoaching.co. Now, the CSM Mastermind series is a live and unscripted discussion where we dig into a single topic relevant to customer success. No matter where you work, what your role is, or who your customers are, we've got you covered. A few housekeeping items before we get going. This webinar is recorded and we'll be posting a replay and transcript on our website early next week. We encourage active participation, so please feel free to ask your questions using that Q&A button that's located at the bottom of your Zoom interface. Questions with higher upvotes will receive priority during the Q&A session. And for our LinkedIn Live audience, you can also post your questions directly and they will be relayed to us. Now, to maintain a smooth discussion, please use the chat window exclusively for commentary while directing your questions to the Q&A window. Now, there's a bunch of thought leadership out there along with loads of theories on how to deliver customer success. But in this series, we're going to focus on practical real-world advice, best practices, techniques, and shared experiences from those who are actually doing customer success day in and day out. Now, to make that happen, we've invited three amazing panelists to join me for a roundtable discussion. These are folks who are really damn good at what they do, and we're going to ask them to spill the beans on their experiences and perspectives. So without further ado, I want our panelists to introduce themselves to y'all, share a little bit about who they are and what they do. And let's get started as usual in alphabetical order with Amy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. My name is Amy Wheldon, and I'm the VP of Customer Success for Randstad RiseSmart. And I have been a customer success leader for over a decade. Prior to wearing an official CSM hat, I worked in operations for about 10 years. And I like to joke that, I found I focused on CS activities before CS, officially had a title. And now there's college courses you can take for it, which I love. Long story short, joking aside, the thing that I love about customer success is that it continues to evolve. This is the only industry that I've worked in where everyone is always learning all the time. And there's a lot of community that is focused on helping each other learn together. And I think, being a proponent of learning in all shapes and forms, I think that community learning has a special place. So I'm super excited to be here. I'm a huge fan of Success Hacker, and I'm excited to be here with these panelists because we all have shared experiences. And I wish that I could have learned from other people's mistakes, especially when it comes to CS, because I've made a lot of mistakes and I've got some things right.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy. Yeah, we've all made a lot of mistakes, haven't we? That's awesome. Thanks, Amy. Chad, you're up.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. And yes, I have definitely made a lot of mistakes in my career. So my name is Chad Horenfeldt. I'm the VP of Customer Experience here at a company called Path Factory. We're a content intelligence platform, and we help uncover new buyers, and we help accelerate buyers through the pipeline. And actually, ServiceNow is a customer of ours. In terms of myself, a little bit of background on me. I've been in customer success for a number of years. I've actually started as a customer success manager and then moved into management. And prior to Path Factory, I've been part of some very successful companies and had very good exits. I was part of Eloqua that sold eventually to Oracle for about $1 billion. And most recently, I was at Customer, and Customer was sold to Meta for also about $1 billion. So now I find myself at Path Factory. Path Factory has my team is customer success managers, support, professional services. We call it solutions team here, about 35 plus people around the globe. So super happy to be part of this. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Look forward to get moving.
Awesome. Thanks, Chad. And thanks for joining us during your event that you're at in New York today.
I'm not passionate. I'm doing a webinar at a customer success event.
I love that.
So it's an event.
An event. Thank you. Thanks, Chad. And last but certainly not least, Patrice.
Hi, everybody. Patrice Sawchuk. I am a Senior Director of Customer Success at ServiceNow. Similarly to my esteemed panelists here, I also kind of grew up within customer success, been in the space before it was really what it is today. Started my career off in software consulting, which I always say, if you want to learn about your product and your customers, like get in the field and deploy it. You're even, more valuable on the customer success side of things. But I also started out as a CSM. So I feel like that's super valuable perspective moving into a leadership role, being a CSM for many years and kind of ascended the leadership ladder. I've been privileged to build, lead, and scale now 3 different success programs at different companies. And you take a little bit from everything. And I think everyone will find bits and pieces of what we share today that may be relevant, may not be relevant. Success is a little different flavor everywhere, but the core tenets are the same. And so hopefully everybody takes a little something away from today. And if anything else, you can build your network of the folks that participate and, welcome everyone to add me onto LinkedIn here today as well. So thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Patrice. Once again, we all appreciate your time today. So now let's get to the topic at hand. Today, we're tackling a topic often overlooked or ignored by many customer success professionals: aligning customer outcomes with their corporate objectives. As individual contributors working on the front lines with our customers, we have a unique opportunity and obligation to uncover the connections between our clients' desired outcomes and their overarching business goals. However, too often we fall into this trap of focusing solely on the short-term issues and the tactical solutions without considering the broader strategic impact of our actions. So let me ask you this. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you've helped the customer achieve a specific outcome only to realize later that it had little or no impact on their company's overall success? Or worse, have you ever unknowingly worked against your customers' corporate objectives because you failed to understand the bigger picture? Now, the harsh reality is that if we're not proactively seeking to align customer outcomes with corporate goals, we're not truly fulfilling our roles as strategic partners. We may be satisfying immediate needs, but we need to deliver the long-term value that our customers and our own organizations depend on. So to kick off our discussion, I'd like to pose a bold question to our guests. In your experience, what are the consequences of failing to align customer outcomes with corporate objectives? And how can our customer champions take ownership of this critical responsibility, even when it might not explicitly be part of their job description?
Yeah, I'll go jump in here.
Go for it, Amy.
I think this is a really important piece of being a CSM, the shifting from reactive to proactive and understanding how much of a strategic advisor you can be to your customer if you understand their corporate objectives. When customer outcomes and corporate objectives aren't aligned, there's essentially ripple effects of negative consequences. I mean, kind of at the most, you can have wasted resources inside your company and your customer's company. You can kind of ruin the brand image of what the value prop of what your service is delivering. If the individual people using the software don't see the value in it, then the adoption is going to be really low. It's going to be hard to justify the expense at renewal. You can, have champions that are no longer, a lot of champions feel a sense of responsibility when they launch a software product. They are taking on the image that they are responsible for this and the success of it within the company. So if you make your champion look bad, then chances are that champion's not going to stay a champion for very, very long. And the overall result is that you're going to have unhappy customers. You're not going to be able to justify the cost of your software. So the way that I found to be most effective is what, I think Andrew is going to talk about today, being the voice of the customer, advocating for things that reduce the friction points for the customer. Those are all CSM things that you can do to take ownership. But really, it boils down to the why. Why did they buy your product? What are they trying to achieve? And then how does that tie back to why their business thinks they should continue to invest money in your software? And long story short, if that business is successful, then they're going to continue to have money to buy your product. So the ways that you can align what their overarching goals are as a business, what they're trying to drive for in their strategy, and tie that back to your product and how you help that, you're just guaranteeing that they're going to continue to see the value in your software.
You're making yourself sticky, right? You're hey, we helped you achieve this objective or this set of objectives. Why would you consider going anywhere else?
Right. The evidence doesn't lie.
Mhm.
Exactly. Patrice, Chad, you got anything to add to that?
One thing that I was going to mention, and we may come back to this, is when we talk about customer objectives and their company objectives, I think we take for granted sometimes in this space that customers don't always know nor how to articulate it or how to even put a plan on a page. And
Yes.
so I think sometimes we go into our engagements expecting them to be able to kind of hand that information to us. And so that's where doing pre-work, right? There's so much information out there on your customer, their 10K report, their earnings reports. Just go to their website. And arrive with a perspective. It's okay if it's not 100%. And I think it's actually really impressive to a customer when you can say, hey, I did some research and here are some things your CEO is talking about, and validate that and then start to cascade those things down. I mean, that's bringing like the thought leadership to the table for your customer versus kind of the more passive, I don't want to say passive, but it's a more passive way of waiting for them to give you the information and then putting that plan on a page. A lot of customers, like, remember, strategy is not everybody's full-time job, right? And you might be working with a platform owner or a technical resource, and they might need help to put those plans together. And that's where we can really help.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and I'd say exactly the same thing. Like, part of a role of a customer success manager when a client is at a certain ACV, which is, how much they're paying you on an annual basis, is to be that blind spot. Because a lot of us just think, oh, they bought us for a certain reason and they're doing stuff in the app. And it's normal. It'll just kind of keep going. But we've been seeing in the last 3 or 4 years how crazy things are. So you had the pandemic and some companies just completely laid off all sorts of people, depending on the industry. And so all that setup that was done just goes out the window and you have to reset the system up. And, the person who's your customer, let's say they're an administrator or something like that, they don't even know what to do. Like they may just be left with the bag or they may have been laid off themselves. And then on the flip side, after not post-COVID, but during COVID, when things started to kind of go back to some sort of weird normal where companies were taking off, especially in the technology industry, that caused a whole bunch of other problems. And so you have to, whatever the customer is telling you, you have to look at what's going on actually and say, actually, you were configured in a certain way at a certain point, but things have changed. And now for many companies, they're scaling back again. So yeah, you really have to be that blind spot. And the other thing I would say is that, and I think you were alluding to this a little bit, Patrice, is that the people that buy the product aren't actually the people that may be setting up the product and using the product. And so you do that pre-work at the front, which is great. But then sometimes you have to almost like resell the product to the people who are actually going to be using it because this product's landed in someone's lap and they're like, what the hell is this? Like, I've got my own things I have to do. And are you giving this to me? I mean, how does that work? And so it's like, you have to help them line it up to their corporate objectives. And it's kind of how you sort of structure the onboarding process, how you maintain relationships with the people who made the decisions versus those people who are actually, on the ground, and understanding their different mentalities. That person that's actually going to be administrating, their main role may not be that high level business outcome. Their main role may be, I want to go home and have dinner tonight, with my family. I want to get out of here. I want to get my job done. So those are some things to think about and consider.
Well, yeah, I mean, you always got to be thinking about the what's in it for me for those end users. But I think you bring up a really good point in that I think it was Patrice in that one of probably the most common reasons that CS folks are don't align customer outcomes with corporate objectives is because the people they're dealing with just don't know.
Yeah.
Right. And so you need to be proactive in making those connections, either bringing those to the table or trying to get them to loop people in.
Yeah.
Right. Because just kind of shrugging their shoulders and saying, I don't know, and thinking about it from their own perspective, which is understandable. I just think that this new feature is going to allow me to get home at a decent hour so I can go watch my kid play soccer. But what are some of the other reasons that you think customer success professionals fail to align customer outcomes with corporate objectives, and how could we actually address those issues?
I think that a lot of customer success people, and specifically on the customer success managers, don't necessarily know how to have some of those conversations. So discovery is something that is typically something you hear salespeople do, and it's kind of their area. But I think customer success management 101 was, help customer, and really like being a customer success helper, almost being like a glorified support and helping them use the product more, training, education, almost troubleshooting. And the switch that needed to be made, especially in this economy, is being that strategist and being that person that's doing that discovery, and not just asking, what are your goals? But literally like asking a more in-depth question. So one of the questions I like to ask, and I learned this from Bob London, who's like, this chief listening officer. And this is a great question. It's like, if we're sitting around with your board today, and let's say it's like an S&B company, smaller company, maybe a startup. We're sitting around with your board today. What's the number one priority they're going to be talking about? And you could take that question and modify a little bit. Let's say you work with the marketing team. That's your main client. Like that's what we have at Path Factory. If the marketing team was sitting around a table right now or on a Zoom, what's the number one challenge that they're having right now? And so you really have to ask better questions and do better discovery.
Yeah. One of my favorite questions to ask your champion or your key contact is, what are you willing to share with me around how you're measured, right? What does your leadership expect out of you, right? Like, what are your goals, your KPIs? And that can feel like a bit of a personal question, but how really your mission is to make your key contacts look great and be successful. And if you don't know what's going to help them to be successful or how they're being measured or what their leadership expects out of them, then how can you really narrow your focus?
That's a question that I always ask.
Yeah.
And we're typically dealing with leaders when we're talking to them about our programs, but what's one of the first questions I ask, right? How are you measured? Right? What's important to you? Help me understand, right? Because those are the types of things where you can kind of suss out, okay, well, what are your corporate objectives? Because they're likely being measured and they're also likely being compensated based on achieving objectives that have been set by their boss, by the board, what have you. And speaking of questions, by the way, if you have questions, please use our Q&A functionality to ask them. I love that you brought up Bob London, Chad. Actually, Bob is delivering his strategic customer conversations workshop through our platform these days. So we have that as one of our offerings.
I would totally take that.
Partnered up with him because we got so much great feedback from folks that took his stuff. So
yeah, I'm a huge fan. On the topic of questions, open-ended questions are so powerful. Knowing what is the individual person that you're working with, why, and sometimes if you're in react mode, I found it really helpful to have a question bank. And I know this is something that Bob London teaches too. He gives some examples of good questions to ask. But when you're not in the middle of putting out fires, something that I found was really valuable for me and for my teams was to create a question bank of those questions. How are you measured? Granted, you want to be curious. You want to continue to ask open-ended questions whenever you're engaging with a customer. I think the discovery process never ends. To Chad's point, I think you're always discovering and learning new things about the business because their business is changing too. But no, I think it's really important to know, like Andrew said, what is going to get your primary stakeholder promoted? What matters to them? What matters to their boss? How do you make them look good? Because they are your primary path to the rest of the organization. And so you need to build trust with them. And so by knowing what they're motivated and how they're compensated or rewarded for the work that they do, you can help them deliver on that goal.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, this is not about you. This is about them, right? And we need to play into that whole ego card, as I like to put it, right? This is about making them look like the smartest people at their company, for bringing you in, for embracing what you have, right? And everything that you do and all the questions that you ask should be focused on ensuring that that they're getting a return on their investment, and the people within their organization understand that value that's been created. And this is where connecting the dots between what you are doing and overarching corporate objectives become incredibly important for them and for you to keep your relationship going with them.
I just had a conversation I'll share. It's just so fresh in my mind, and something you just said just kind of triggered the thought. But I was just coaching someone from my team today around that kind of value narrative is something that often needs to be taught, right? And so if our stakeholder or champion, whomever we're working with, is unable to articulate, like they may love us, they may love the work we do, they may love our product, but they may not necessarily make the decision around renewal or expansion or whatever the case may be. And they're an influencer. Now we certainly want to, there's tons of value in having, relationships all over the organization, but your influencer needs to be taught how to read that value narrative back internally, right? Like we're not going to have that opportunity to do that, right? That's a sales motion. But so if we can work to help our champions articulate that, right, in a way that is going to influence whomever makes the decisions, right? That's something we also, I think we forget that. And also in addition to helping them understand their objectives and putting a plan on a page, they then need to go share that up to get investment. And we need to coach them on how to do that. Depending on what their role is, that might not be natural for them. So that's where we can also help them.
That's a great point. I mean, while we may be communicating the value that they've achieved as part of a business review or what have you, it is incredibly powerful when their own people are communicating that to the right people in the organization.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, we talked about discovery questions, and that's a really good way to uncover outcomes and such. But the other problem is that a lot of CSMs, they get mixed up between tactics and goals and outcomes, and you have to really break this down for them. And we're in this process right now. We're teaching the team how to ask better questions. And then we're actually taking these different areas and breaking them down because there's outcomes. So an outcome could be increased sales. It could be reduced costs. Then there's success metrics. So success metrics, it could be, I want to increase the amount of revenue by 20% by the end of Q2. So you have to have some almost that smart component to it. And then there's a tactical component of it is I'm going to do X, Y, and Z or Z to actually achieve those particular items. And so a lot of the times, a CSM will say, oh, well, their goal is to use this product. And it's like, no, that's not a goal. That's a tactic. And so you have to be very stringent with your teams to teach them those things and that they're recording the right thing. And if they're not getting the right pieces of information, I think to Patrice and to Amy's point is that you have to bring the right thing in. And another thing that we've done, I think this will make it easier, because a lot of times, those people, at the lower, your main point of contact, your champion, they don't know those things either. To make it easier, what we've done is we've bucketed our outcomes into different categories, and we're still in the process of doing this. And then you can show that on a slide and say, okay, what I think I've heard from you is that, this is how you're being measured. This is typically how other clients have set an outcome, and these are typical metrics that they've done. How does that sound to you? And if you're still not getting much from them, you need to up-level the conversation and say, listen, here's what I suggest. Perhaps we want to have a broader conversation so that we align around this, and this is a line I like to use. I know you love our product and I know it's helping you, but I want to make sure that we're having this conversation, at renewal time or post-renewal time. And so I need to help you make sure that, you sell this internally. That's kind of how I've brokered those conversations, but this is not a overnight transformation. This takes a lot of time. It takes process, playbooks, etc.
It takes a lot of good questions. It takes a lot of good listening. Let's not forget the importance of actively listening. It takes a lot of empathy, understanding the customer, these folks' perspective, whether they're an individual contributor that's just trying to get out the door to go see their kid play soccer, or it's a senior executive, a key stakeholder that's got compensation tied to hitting something that you may be playing a part in. Can any of you share a story of when you or a team member discovered a misalignment between a customer's desired outcome and their corporate goals, and how you handled that situation? Any lessons learned? Anybody?
I went first last time. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I can share. We see this a lot, and I actually think it really kind of dovetails very nicely into what Chad just mentioned, because I think we really forget that there is a hierarchy. And I think where we see this happen the most is because we've not constructed that hierarchy. And I would always recommend top down, because if we start with the tactics, we could get ourselves caught in just doing stuff. I mean, like, if there's anyone from my team on here, they're going to roll their eyes and say it all the time. We're doing stuff, right? But why? What does the stuff mean? And so when you don't start top down, now there will almost always be situations where there's stuff that just needs to get done, right? They're sunsetting old technology or whatever. There's just stuff that needs to happen. But if you don't start in this hierarchy of strategic objectives, right, then down to the how we're going to measure it, right? What's our target? Where are we now? And how are we going to measure attainment? And then what are the major bodies of work to help us get there? And I think when we don't go through that process, we start doing work and we have no tie to strategic objectives. And that's where I most see that kind of misalignment or just lack of alignment, right? And I think depending on where you're working in the organization, if you're working with a, platform owner, they may have stuff they want to get done, but it doesn't tie to their, the renewal decision makers' objectives. And so when we get really distracted in doing somebody's work that doesn't tie to strategic objectives, we're never going to be able to show value.
I love that. I'm a huge fan of the OGSM framework, which is objectives, goals, strategy, measures, and then I add an A on the end for action plan. And you may have a variety of those at whatever organization you're working with. It's kind of like a strategy spin on SMART goals. And, much like Chad, making sure that there's team definitions on what is the success metric, what are the outcomes, making sure that people have alignment. And so when people come to me and they say, we want to do XYZ with a customer, I'm like, well, is this an objective? Is it a goal? Is it how you're going to measure it? And I make them bucket it and then think about, well, what are we missing from the whole picture? If this is the overarching goal and this is how we're going to get there, we can work backwards at how are we going to measure it? What are the milestones that we need to hit to get there? And what are the I think I said steps we're going to take to get there. It's just really important to be methodical because you can get super busy doing the stuff. I'm going to incorporate that, Patrice. That is my new favorite thing. It's so easy to get bogged down in doing the stuff that you forget that you beyond the stuff.
It's important to someone, right? Yeah. But is it important to the right person? We have to really and we might do it anyway.
Yeah.
But we need to prioritize the work that's ultimately going to lead to what is most meaningful to the customer.
So one of the strategies I used to advise teams on was, that kickoff call is so important to get everybody, including the key stakeholders, so that you can at least from the call determine if there's alignment, right? And you have that key stakeholder who made the decision explaining on that call, here's why we made this decision to go with this vendor, along with everybody up and down the line, all the way down to the boots on the ground individual end users. And then from that call, you can typically gauge, okay, do we have alignment or do we have an alignment problem? And so it's one of those things, though, net, it's one of those things that you can't wait on. You can't avoid having that conversation. You can't avoid, you can't push that realization out, because the further down the path you go, the more effed up things are going to get, the harder it's going to be to get it back on track.
Yeah, I would say, just to add, I was going to say, there's a couple of key meetings to have with your clients, and obviously the kickoff is one of those. The other one is with business reviews and QBRs and EBRs, whatever you want to call them. So we've completely changed this, and we've taken all of this work that we're doing around outcomes and really trying to make sure we understand those and connect with the decision makers. And we've put a lot of effort around this QBRs, and we've thrown out the term QBR. We're calling it strategic checkpoint. And the way that we're framing it to customers is saying, listen, we don't want to do a review. We're going to spend a little bit, 20% of the time doing a review, but we want to look forward. We want to do more forward looking and spend more of the time there. And we try and differentiate ourselves from any other vendor that's doing this, because there's so many boring customers, QBRs. But I like to think back to when I was a kid and I had to do a book review in front of the class, and if all the other kids were just bored out of their minds, and that is your executive. They are bored out of their minds. They've turned off their Zoom, and what you need to do is just almost treat it like a board meeting. And by a board meeting, what you do is you do you do a lot of pre-work. You ask questions ahead of time. You gather the information. You come up with data, but that's just a tiny little bit of data to start the conversation. You put the rest in the appendix. You send it 72 hours ahead of time. You have 2 to 3 discussion points, and then you ask them for feedback and make sure they've read it ahead of time. And you completely flip the script on the QBR. And that's where you focus on confirming the outcomes and then building a plan, and not just, your goal is not to get through your slides, because that's sort of the CSM 101, where it should be align on what their outcomes are and put a plan together to make sure you're achieving it, and then build a success plan off of that. And obviously you can't do that with every client, and depending on, the average, annual payment that they're giving to you. But with those high paying customers, you really need to be thinking in this type of a term and just reframing how you're doing things. Because the old playbook in this economy is not going to work.
We actually did something similar where we changed up our business review strategy, calling them, partner reviews. And what we found, actually, this was Andrew's question a minute ago that I didn't quite get around to answering, was that we had a huge global organization that was going through transformational change. They were an airline. It was during the pandemic. And you can imagine how they were faring, right? Who had a super engaged head of learning and development. And his measure of success was he wanted specialized career pathing so that people could essentially find the training that they needed to take the next step in their career. So we spent a ton of time building out this really specialized career pathing initiative, so that if people wanted to go to their boss and get a promotion, it was already built out. They had to do the pre-work for that. And then what came to light in our business review with them, once we changed our tactics, was really the organization needed him to deliver frameworks on cross-functional collaboration as they were going through transformational change. And yeah, career pathing was great, but that impacted about 5% of the organization that wanted some sort of movement in their career. And the other 95% needed help with change exhaustion and building trust and building influence. But had we not changed our strategy, and instead of slide decking them to death, had been really curious about, this is what the data shows us, wins, losses, whatever our insights are around that, and engage and encourage that conversation, we would have never learned that. We were failing them. And it became very clear that we were failing in delivering on the business objectives. We were not aligned in any way, even though we were delivering them of great value if they had wanted to do career pathing across the org.
So any other, that's great. Any other steps people can take to kind of proactively uncover those connections between customer objectives and corporate strategies, even if that information isn't readily available or it's openly discussed, besides what we've already talked about?
Another thing I'll mention, and Chad mentioned this briefly, we've done quite a bit of this at ServiceNow, is there's always one-off kind of custom random things you can't anticipate, but we should be experts in our space, whether it's the product that you serve or the industry your customers in, or, the persona that you're targeted towards. And if your organization doesn't do this now, it's definitely something to bring back, because it's also a key to scalability. There's got to be a catalog of top or key objectives that your organization knows are important to customers, and you can align them, all different types of ways. We've got a pretty complex platform at ServiceNow, so we align it to our product suite, and then through success, we kind of make them higher level objectives. But if a customer purchases whatever product from us, we know what problems those products are trying to solve for, right? Like in the market. Otherwise, how are we marketing them? How are we selling them? But there's often a disconnect between marketing and engineering and selling and success. And so the success organization needs to be armed with what are those top objectives, pain points, whatever you want to call it, my customer solving for by purchasing my technology or product or whatever it is. And that is a perfect way to come in with thought leadership around your company and something for the customer to think about, right? And again, it's like similarly to coming in, doing some research. Doesn't have to be perfect. They could say, these all stink, let's start over. But it gets the conversation started. More often than not, they'll find a couple of things on that list that resonate, and it just kind of gets those creative juices flowing.
Yeah, you're not, and that's a great suggestion. It's actually something that we've worked with a couple of different organizations on, doing these workshops where we get these, we come up with a set of their most common desired outcomes, and then from that build an inventory of questions for them to dig deeper, and then also figure, okay, well, how do we help achieve this? But when you walk in and you say, okay, so tell me about your desired outcomes, and how they connect to corporate objectives, they look at you like deer in headlights, right? Like, well, what do you mean? Right? So you have to be, you're not, by sharing these, here's typically what our customers are looking at. Like you said, Patrice, you're getting the kind of the juices flowing. You're not telling them the answer, but you're like a good consultant, you're leading them down the path by making some suggestions, throwing some things out there.
Yeah, like another thing that we do is we look at their data, and we give them little tidbits. Like I'm seeing this, and if we compare you against benchmark data, there's some areas that you're not doing as well in that I think we should talk about. Or looks like something's different over here. That's much different than it was 3 months ago. And so those are things that you can do to like spark a conversation, to engage the customer, and not sending an email, hey, we haven't talked in a while, let's check in. So that's the thing. It's like, this is part of this change environment. Your customers are working with lots of vendors, or they're getting rid of lots of vendors potentially, but there's less people in their teams typically. They have less time, and they're really choosing what are those vendors that are actually providing me value. And also it's not just that, like we were just talking about the whole webinar today, is selling that value up and making sure that there's alignment, so that they're working on the right things. And so that's the difference too. It's like you can point out data discrepancies, but you have to make sure that that is the right thing that they should be focusing on.
Yeah.
One other thing that we do is we take it down a level even deeper beyond the outcome categories. We also have use cases in terms of different approaches that other customers are using our product. And so, and this is something this is our focus for Q1. We're building this out. And it's important because not only do you have to uncover the outcomes, but you're also dealing with people who have less time and less attention, and to convince them to do these things. A great technique is saying, hey, a customer that's similar to you in your industry, similar size, they've done these things, and this is the result. This is the outcome you're trying to achieve that we've talked about. And so getting them to kickstart into action is a whole other area that's important.
I love those benchmarks. Hey, if you do this, look what you can achieve. Let's turn to some questions. We got some questions in Q&A. By the way, Patrice, I see you've already volunteered to answer questions. So, Amy, Chad, if you open up the Q&A window, if there's questions there that you are particularly fond of jumping in on first, I'll call on you. But our first question here comes from Marjorie. And remember, folks, if you see a question on this list and you want to get it answered, upvote it. And we'll answer questions for about the next half an hour. Remember, we go until 15 past the hour. If you have to leave at the top of the hour, we understand. The recording of this webinar and the transcript will be available on our website sometime early next week. So Marjorie, thank you, Marjorie, for joining us and for the question. What do you recommend doing with unresponsive clients or clients that take too much time to respond? And Patrice, looks like you wanted to jump in on that one right out of the gate. So what have you got for Marjorie?
So Chad really just answered it for me, and it was exactly how I would answer it. I think you have to understand the why, right? So think about all the vendors that these customers have, right? Like think about all the technologies. Every one of those has some sort of vendor management or success function that wants to meet with you. And that's not their priority, right? Their job is something entirely different, right? They might do marketing, they might do sales, right? So they have a whole full function, and then they've got to carve out time to meet with success people or vendors. And so you have to really make that there's got to be a compelling reason for them to come to the table. I would suspect that one of two things is going on. If your client is unresponsive, you either need to revisit your contact, right? Like, are you working with the right people? Or is there a compelling reason for them to prioritize your meeting or a response to you? And so, at the end of the day, we've got to make sure that the time we spend with our customers is really valuable, providing insights and leading them through their journey and all the things we talked about today. If we're not doing those things, like those are the unresponsive customers.
Valuable to who? Valuable to the customer success manager, or valuable to the customer?
To the customer.
Okay.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
always the customer. Yeah.
Okay, good.
If we're going through a list of things that we did for them last quarter, that's not going to be compelling for them.
So I've kind of got a follow-up question to Marjorie's. How do you, and this was one of the follow-up questions that we didn't get to, but I think it's relevant. How can CSMs effectively communicate the importance of aligning customer outcomes with corporate objectives to their colleagues and to customers, especially when they're faced with resistance or skepticism or, crickets?
I think wherever possible, you should try to co-create solutions with your customer. And I think that's what Patrice and Chad were talking about, is finding the why. I mean, obviously, you need to build a level of trust. And if they don't want to engage with you, it can be really challenging to try to win people over to even make time for you, right? So when you do have them on, to Patrice's point, you need to make sure that you are making it as customer-centric as possible. You are focusing on that shared success, and you have to understand what matters to them. I think there's an element of, make sure that you're using your de-escalation techniques, you're acknowledging, you're understanding, you're addressing their concerns, you're reading the room. A good exercise to do is understand, if you have multiple stakeholders, especially understand who are promoters, who are detractors, who are passive. So a lot of the sales techniques that your sales team is probably using can be really, really helpful post-sales too. Because it just like it takes a lot of effort to influence a buyer's journey, that buyer becomes a customer, and how are we learning about how influence is held at the company, and how are we finding advocates? This is going to vary, of course, if they're really, really small and you have one point of contact who's like, I didn't buy this, I don't want to work with you. Then go look on the internet, do your pre-work, do your homework, and figure out what could they possibly need help with, and where are the business challenges. And if you, they're a bigger organization, then you want to make sure you've mapped out your stakeholders and you understand to the best that you can the dynamics of the challenges that they face day to day. Because you may have someone who wants to drive all the initiatives forward for your software, but they are blocked by legal or communications or sales or whoever could potentially be a gatekeeper in the organization. And then it's a matter of, can I help them apply influence? Can I help them? Because there's, it's that second sale. How do I teach my stakeholder to turn around and sell this product inside their company? How do I get everyone interested? And if they're resistant to that and they don't want to do that work, then you have to build trust with them. And you do that by understanding what matters to them.
Play the ego card.
Yep.
I want to help you get promoted for being the smartest person here, for embracing us, right? Play the ego card.
Yeah.
Awesome. Marjorie, thank you for your question. Our next question comes from Monica. Monica, thanks for joining us and thanks for the question. Monica asks, when dealing with a complex organization with multiple business units, how do you recommend finding the business objectives and tracking metrics to multiple objectives, especially if they were not uncovered in the pre-sales motion? You haven't. It looks like Patrice wants to jump in on this again, but yeah, I'm assuming you've never seen this at ServiceNow, huh, Patrice?
I was just going to say, I lucked out. I'm picking questions right as someone tees it up for me. Like Amy just teed this one up for me. So I'll start and then invite you in, Amy, because it sounds like you've got some thoughts here. But I guess first and foremost, what I would say is multiple stakeholders is exactly what we want, right? Mm-hmm. So that actually means that you are penetrating the business and you're finding other people to work with, and you're helping your software or whatever it is that you have become more sticky. That's expansion opportunities. We all want our companies to be successful, and our companies are successful by our customers staying with us and growing. And so, you can only grow so much in one function, right? And so if your product is applicable in more than one function, because I recognize that some may not be, you really want multiple stakeholders. Now, it definitely makes our engagement model more complex. Amy mentioned stakeholder mapping, so critical, right? Like, who's that champion? Who's that detractor? Who's that influencer? Who's my, key contact? I think the biggest mistake we can make with, multiple stakeholders is making assumptions that what's important to one is important to another. And so often these stakeholders sit in different functions in the business, right? Like what's important to an HR function is going to be different than an IT function, vice versa. However, just to kind of put a bow back on the whole reason why we're here today, it is always important to tie all of those back up to the corporate objectives, right? And so again, that top-down storytelling is still appropriate. And actually it gets a little bit more difficult, but it's even more important because the conversation gets muddier when you've got HR objectives and IT objectives and sales objectives and marketing objectives, if you're not saying, and this is how it ties to what your CEO wants to do this year, right? So that's kind of my thoughts, but I'll invite, Amy, and if you have anything else to add, since you teed me up there on that one.
I think you covered it really well. I think that tying back to the corporate objectives is the key piece when there's multiple stakeholders. And you got to remember that there may be organizations that you're working with that are in different regions. They operate different. They operate in silos. They may not even be aware of how their objectives and what's being achieved could impact other regions, good and bad, right? So that's part of being the strategic advisor, is connecting those dots wherever possible. And that requires a huge amount of curiosity. Actually, if I could define the two things that I think make great CSMs, are curiosity and resilience. Being curious, always be curious about your customers. So I think you said it really well, and I'm starting to ramble. So I'm going to pass it over to Chad because it looks like he has something insightful.
I was just gonna say, like, don't be scared of your customers. Like, be okay with pushing back. So I'll give you a great example. There was a customer, and the decision maker called a meeting. It was myself that was in it, and as the VP, and the AE was in it, and I had the CSM in it. And actually, the CSM wasn't invited because they were just so upset. And they were like, "Listen, our teams that are operating are misaligned." And I just see I don't feel like they're working on the right things. And I threw it back to them. I was like, well, why is that happening? What can we do here to improve that? Like, do they actually understand what the corporate objectives are? And the decision maker, he kind of paused and he said, you know what? I haven't communicated well enough what I'm trying to do here. And so that's just some advice as well. It's like, don't expect that your customers have their stuff together. And I think that's kind of one of the things that we mentioned as well. It's not just up the chain, it's down the chain too. So it's just part of what we have to do. I think I mentioned being at blind spot, pointing out faults. That's just being that strategic advisor, and don't be afraid to do that.
Absolutely cannot be afraid to do that. Do not tell your customers what you think they want to hear. You need to tell them what they need to hear. Right? You create more problems for them and yourselves. Monica, thank you for the question. Hey, Patrice, could you hit the done button on Monica's question for me, please? Our next question comes from anonymous attendee. What change management techniques would you suggest for a key person who isn't fond of your product because they ultimately did not make the decision to take your product? How do we transform these individuals into champions or advocates of your product? Amy, looks like you want to jump in on this. I also have my 2 cents as well. So Amy, what have you got to say to so-called anonymous attendee?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, there are a ton of change management techniques out there, and there's different ones for different situations. So if you're not familiar with change management, there is a whole wealth of information for you to go learn about. What I found to be really helpful, at least in the industries that I've worked in, is the influence model created by McKinsey, because it's super simple. I'm all about keeping things as simple as possible, and people on my teams adopt it because it's easy to understand. There's only 4 parts to it, and they're really about making sure that there's understanding. So the why, like the compelling story, why is this happening? And I think of a time where I had an admin who was super unhappy with the solution that our company had bought. They bought it before they hired her, and then they brought her to come in, and she's like, I don't want to learn this new system. And you're locked into a contract for 36 months. So we're going to, and I really just address the elephant in the room. Like, your company is paying for this for the next 3 years. In 3 years, if you want to move to a different solution, that's totally fine. I will make recommendations, or I will help you, or introduce you to a partner that does something similar, because I want to see you have success. But in the meantime, here's how we can focus on success together. What is it that you're trying to achieve? Let's make a game plan and make it happen. And I think really her resistance came around the time investment I learned about her, right? The time investment that it would take to learn a new software, and that she didn't have confidence that we could make her look good in her job. She was new to her role and she wanted to look good. Those are going to vary from customer to customer, right? Like, the reasons why people are detractors or unhappy with your solution are going to vary, but you can't overcome the problem if you don't understand the why. And if you happen to be in their city, try to schedule lunch with them. Try to do something non-Zoom related if you can. There's so many ways you can tactfully engage your customer and provide value, but make sure you are never asking for their time and not giving them something of value. Like I said, don't slide deck them to death. Make sure that you are concise and punchy, and you get to the point whenever they need to interact with you. And then you do things like good meeting hygiene, sending agendas ahead of time. People generally that don't want to engage with you, they will perform better if you let them know what to expect from you. And that's in all walks of life, right? Like, people know what to expect from you. If you set healthy expectations for them, then they're more comfortable engaging with you because it's no longer an unknown.
I want to add to that, figuring out, and this may require some additional research and potentially talking to some of this this individual's peers, but figuring out what their WIFM is.
Yeah.
Right. What that while they may not be happy about your product, is there a way that you can frame this so that it really kind of speaks to them, like the person who didn't want to implement a new collections module for an accounting package I used to be part of, but when we explained it as, hey, you're going to be able to leave the office at 5 p.m. so you can get to your kid's soccer game at 6. Okay, I framed it in a way that really kind of sang to them, right? That spoke to them, and something they personally wanted to gain from it. So think about the WIFM. Patrice, Chad, you got anything to add?
No.
Okay,
Good.
Awesome. Amy, can you hit the done button on that, please? Our next question, hold on, let me refresh this. Make sure that we've got our next question comes from Michelle. Michelle asks, following up on Monica's question, how to reach out to multiple stakeholders when your initial stakeholder is blocking you. They want all control and acting as a gatekeeper. And it looks like, Chad, you want to jump in on this. I take it you've had to deal with this before?
Yeah, I mean, we all have to deal with this, and it's a very sensitive area. I think there's a tool that we started to use more effectively called Sales Navigator by LinkedIn. And what I really like about it is it's a lot of times customer success is all about connections and relationships. And I like to boil it down to like 2 things: trust and value. And if you're having a tough time connecting with your customer or influencing them, it's typically that there's a trust deficiency there. And so what I try and do is I try to look to see who has relationships with people in that organization that can help me, whether it's another customer, whether it's someone in our organization and maybe an executive. And I try and leverage the relationships. I think that's really what's important there. And so that way, it's not like you're trying to go around them. You're just leveraging, another relationship that you have. And sometimes I play dumb and say, oh, I didn't know, I just was reaching out to this person because, I wanted to like connect with them and make sure that they were informed about something. And so, I mean, sometimes you have to do that, right? It was kind of like what I've said before, like you don't be complacent as in customer success. Don't be reactive. If you're not hearing from your customer and there's a problem, do something about it. Because the alternative is churn, essentially. So, exactly. And when you get to that point and you didn't do the proactive steps, like potentially annoying your champion, you'll look worse. Because the questions will be like, well, why didn't you do this? Or why didn't you raise this up to somebody else? And maybe we could have all gotten together and thought about a strategy to connect with the right people. So that's another thing, is ask for help. You're a CSM, but don't think that just because someone says to you, this is your book of business and you're the CEO of your customers, that you don't seek out help. This is not a one-on-one type thing. This is a group. It's a collaborative thing. Usually, your bonuses are tied to the broader team. And seek out help.
Customer success is a team sport.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Anything to add, Patrice, Amy?
It's tricky, sure, right? Like you don't want to compromise relationships and, get shut out. But, to Chad's point, we do need to get creative. Like we can't be, complacent with a stakeholder if we think there's opportunities elsewhere. I think too, you could partner with other, your sales partners and get, strategize with them on how to, because it's advantageous to them to expand into the account.
Awesome. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks for the question. Thanks for joining us today, Chad. If you can get done on that. We've got another question here from anonymous attendee. Anonymous attendee again asks, what techniques would you recommend to have the economic buyer engage with you? And how often should we engage with them? Ultimately, the economic buyer makes the decision for renewal, but they are not the project manager and don't see the detail put in to provide value. Would you suggest a quarterly meeting or some insights or metrics on email of how they are doing with your product? It looks like, Patrice, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I'll get this started. I think there's probably some thoughts from Amy and Chad too. I think there's a lot of things to consider with this. And we've covered a lot of them today. So one of them is stakeholder mapping. So one of the things I ask my teams to do for any account is identify the key people that we want to engage with. And sometimes it's not always going to be with you, right? So we at ServiceNow have executive sponsorship and customer success sponsorship, and we actually fly in executives so they can have an executive to executive relationship. You get better turn up from your customers. If I'm showing up with an executive, your executive's probably going to show up. And it's interesting what you glean out of them. An executive to executive conversation, you get very different information. So I think proper stakeholder mapping. And then the other one is, we talked a lot about how to enable your champion or your stakeholder to influence to that economic buyer or that decision maker. So I think we need to find out who the right person is to align to that buyer. I can't give you like a cadence. I think it's going to depend. But I will tell you, it's not going to be frequent. Like, they have a lot on their plate. And when they come to the table, we have to make sure we're bringing a ton of value. Like, their expectations are going to be much higher. But the more we can influence the people we work with every day to champion the work we're doing with them and the technology that we have, that will help influence your economic buyer as well.
I also think we want to leverage those people that we're working with every day to help assemble the narrative that we are going to be conveying, the story that we're going to be telling to the economic buyer, to make sure that it's in the right language, that it hits the things that they believe this person are going to be able to, this person's going to relate to, that they're going to key off of. We should use the knowledge that they have, which is far more than what we have.
Yeah.
Working within the four walls with that individual, to make sure that narrative is going to is relatable, is going to resound well with that individual.
I think that's a really key piece. I like to understand how my key point of contact is related to the economic buyer. And if you build a lot of trust with your key point of contact, I usually meet with them before business reviews. Mm-hmm. What matters to you? What do you want to present? Use them as your like insider source of information. And because a lot of CSMs think that you need to present your business review to your key stakeholder. No, actually, you need as many executives and decision makers in the room as possible at that business review. So you need to, I mentioned co-create earlier, but you need to create it with them, because you want to be able to show off the work that they've done with you back to their business. That's how I view those strategic checkpoints, those partner reviews. It's really about the company gave a team or a department, a budget holder, some money to get something accomplished. This is how well we've done in accomplishing that goal. This is how well we understand that goal. And this is the person in your organization who's been working behind the scenes to make sure that software company and your company are achieving those goals together.
And they need to be quantifiable, not, hey, your team's more effective. Yeah. Hey, I want an economic buyer, a key stakeholder at that level doesn't want touchy-feely. They want to know that, hey, we increased efficiency by 15%. Hey, revenue has grown, tied to our solution. Revenue has grown by $10 million. I mean, they want to hear specifics. It's got to be objective points, not subjective. I feel like your team's doing well. Sorry, feelings don't work for an economic buyer. Chad, you got anything else to add? Looks like you're getting kicked out of your room, huh? Yeah. Thanks for sticking around. We only got 8 more minutes. So awesome. Let's see. We got another question here from, let me refresh this. We got another question here from Marcelo. I'm trying to, let's see. How about the stewardship regular report could be used, collaborate to make this alignment with the champion contact for customers using KPIs, review results. Alignment with the champion. I think we've pretty much answered that question from the way I can interpret that. But Marcelo, thank you for joining us, and thanks for the question. And then one last question from Carlos. Carlos asks, is this a valid question? How do you measure your goals or achievements? I think we've covered that as well, right? Understanding your key stakeholders' goals or objectives, basically just asking them that question is an absolutely valid question, Carlos.
Yeah. Agreed.
Awesome. Look at this. More questions. I'm surprised. You all had such a wealth of information, and then you spilled the beans early that nobody had questions. You guys were super clear. So, well, I guess with that, we will wrap things up early. We've come to the end of our time together today. So, I definitely want to say how awesome our conversation has been, and thank you all for joining us. But hey, what matters most is what all of you think. So I kindly ask you to share your valuable feedback on LinkedIn, tagging me, our guests, or Success Coaching. Once again, a big thank you to our amazing panelists for generously sharing their ideas, thoughts, insights, best practices, and your time. And let me leave you with this thought. Exceptional customer success managers understand they don't have all the answers, but they sure know where to find them. That's why we've created the CSM Mastermind to tap into the collective knowledge and experience of our community to support everyone's growth. Remember to sign up and mark your calendars for our next event on April 17th, when we'll talk about enabling CSMs as revenue growers. Until then, make sure to make space for yourself and your mindset every single day, and have a great rest of your week and month. We'll see you soon.